Welcome to the Paru Zings Appraisers on Purpose podcast. This podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? And what do they do now for their teams, their clients, and the industry? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
Well, welcome back. We are excited that you're joining us for another informative and exciting episode. I am really thrilled with the opportunity to hear some perspective and experience from our guest, who a number of you may recognize. But before we jump in, a little hold the suspense. Want to make sure that you don't miss the opportunity to not only like the podcast, those metrics make a difference. We all know how important data is, and share the love. This is one for many of us that are not directly in the lending world, but do a lot of other types of valuation work. Going to get a lot of value out of this conversation. I'm very excited today to have David Wilkes with us. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Michael.
I appreciate it. Well, we'd love to know, so were you born this way, or how did life bring you into connection with the valuation profession?
Yeah, well, I could probably make up a story about how I was born to do what I do. I think like a lot of people in valuation field, it sort of comes to you by some serendipity or something like that. And that was certainly the case for me. I always kind of think back to how one of my absolute worst courses in law school was real property.
Oh, no.
So, the last thing I ever thought I would do. I was also really not a math person at all. I was an English major.
Oh, goodness.
I did like statistics, and that was like a little bit of an opening, because I actually do deal with statistics and assessment methodology quite a lot, obviously these days, and so in a way, I guess there was that. But no, I got out of law school not really knowing what I was going to do. I really stumbled into what I do in terms of property tax, and then that led into valuation.
Yeah.
So that's how I got to valuation, was really through property tax work, and it wasn't even valuation related, really. I was working for a law firm, and we had a matter involving a tax lien, and one of our commercial clients realized that if it bought the tax lien, it could control the shopping center it was in, it was in some ancillary litigation, and they felt like this was a good strategy, and nobody knew how to do it, and I was the low man on the totem pole, and so of course it fell to me. And the thing was, though, that I kind of dug in, and I had been doing commercial litigation before that. I think it was not so appealing to me, because every day you'd wake up and you'd have to learn a completely new thing. So you never really felt like you had mastered anything. You felt like you knew a little bit about a whole bunch of things. What I liked about property tax was just that you could really sink into it. You could really get to know it. It was very logical in some ways. There was kind of a system that you had to follow.
Yeah.
And in that case, we did succeed in actually getting the liens, taking over the shopping center.
Yep.
It was a really good success. It was kind of a good opening. And within days, I happened to be reading the want ads and saw that there was an opening for an attorney with one of the local municipalities just north of New York City.
Oh, wow.
That was looking for an attorney to just do property tax work. And I thought, and it was, funny when I look back on it, because I thought, well, that's perfect for me. And little did I know that at the time I knew virtually nothing about property tax. I certainly knew nothing about valuation. But I applied for the job, and I kind of oversold myself and managed to get the job. And actually from there, as I arrived on the scene and suddenly realized that I actually did have to deal with these, what's it worth all day. And then there was an assessor that I worked with who was just truly a real mentor, really, big personality, really, had an opinion about everything. Wasn't always necessarily right, but he had a lot of theories. And it was a great experience for me, because it allowed me to explore creativity within the field, kind of how you factor about a property in a might not look significant to somebody else, but see how that could play out in terms of valuation. And what I also realized pretty quickly was that there was a whole lot that I didn't know, and I sort of stumbled on the New York University has a great real estate program, and I learned about that, and I thought, it'd be great if I kind of went back to school, that's what I ended up doing. And so from there, I really kind of got a lot more into the valuation field and kept going from there. So no, I was not born to it, but that's how I kind of stumbled into it.
That's a phenomenal way. Would you say that your path through law school and then joining a firm was more typical of attorneys, where you get exposed to a number of different cases and you're kind of like, yeah, I kind of like that one, or I don't like that one? Or did you find in law school that most people, like, they knew they definitely wanted to go be a litigator, they wanted to go do IP, or they wanted to go do, some particular subset?
It's a good question, because I think that it always seemed like it was kind of half and half. I don't know if that's exactly right, but it always seemed like there were a lot of people that seemed to be in law school with no idea what they really wanted to do. It's not like when you go to medical school, clearly, it's a lot more focused. Law, yes. A lot of people go, I think I went to law school not even necessarily knowing I wanted to be a lawyer. It was something I really wanted to kind of be involved in business and things like that. And law seemed like it wouldn't be a bad thing to know. I wasn't, but there were a few people, I guess, that did have a very specific focus, like what you said. But I think most people in law school tend to be going there as kind of like they're in a holding pattern looking for what's next. So even I think once you get minted as a lawyer and you go out there, I think a lot of lawyers, it could be a few years. I know that was true for me. I was in commercial litigation for at least a few years before, kind of getting into my groove here. And I think that's true for a lot of people in law.
Yeah, that's kind of been my experience of peers. We do a lot of work in the legal space, and some of them knew, like, they definitely wanted to go, maybe because of a family experience, or there was something about it that guided them in that direction. Most of them were like,
right,
yeah, it's kind of just where I ended up. And I'm here and, making the most of it and focusing on these, real property matters. And it's like, hey, fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's something else. You mentioned the tax lien. That's a space most people have no experience with, but what a fascinating subset of law, because of the prime position of tax liens compared to any other recordings and encumbrances.
I think people don't necessarily realize the impact of the property tax until they're told that their property is going to be taken away because they didn't pay, and that power that the government has.
Yes,
I think in some ways also, and this is true across the board for property taxes, that it's a kind of a unique tax in that if you're in, let's say, the suburbs or a rural environment, you can sometimes kind of go right down the street and meet with the people who are assessing your property, who are charging you your taxes, and it's a different relationship to the government. You can actually talk to that person, see that person. The person's real. It's not sort of, dealing with the IRS or dealing with a state taxation department or something like that.
Yes.
So for better or worse, you may end up with some folks that you're dealing with that you could really work with. You can really kind of engage in an actual conversation. And then again, sometimes there's a lot of power put onto just one person who may or may not have much experience, and that's who you have to deal with. So I always think property tax is like such a sort of hyper local type of a tax, and what we do is very, very hyper local.
I think that's a fascinating and informative way to explain it, given that a lot of people, both in law as well as in valuation, don't intersect with this subset, which is extremely important and exists across the country. I mean, taxation without representation was part of our founding of this country.
Right.
And the work that you have come to specialize in is significantly important, especially in certain areas around the country that have really high property tax rates.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, we have a national organization that I help to run, of people like me in all different states. And, there are certain areas where those people are particularly busy. And then there are other states where not so much, but you really kind of get a feel for it. It is also kind of one of the characteristics about the property tax. Again, it's just so local that there are parts of the country where it's a very significant issue and others where it's really not a major consideration.
It's such an important fact to touch on, because you mentioned like an interest may be around business, and a number of professionals are very business oriented, but it's a different factor when you're dealing with maybe a large corporation or even a multinational, and their consideration for where they're going to, for instance, locate a new development, or they're going to consider a redevelopment. And, taxation is a significant factor in ultimately their cost of operations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whether you're a user or an investor, I think kind of what you're describing is more of the user, where I think sometimes the may not be top of the list of things that they're looking for, but oftentimes, maybe after the fact, it starts to become an issue, concern. That also could be something that leads into negotiations with, if you're a large user, with incentives and things like that, tax breaks. That's something we do some work around, because inevitably, if you're a large owner, large presence in the community, you may only be able to make it work if you can strike some sort of a deal, especially in places like the Northeast where the taxes are so high.
Yeah, that's we know that well here in the Chicagoland area. That is a significant factor, as you're very well aware of us also along the way.
Yeah.
I mean, given how you got first exposed, and then as you shared your great capacity and your first employment opportunity saw the light and brought you in, what were those early assignments like, and how did your learning progress?
I think that one of the best things that I had early on was the fact that I was working in government, because many of the issues might not have necessarily sort of a justifiable dollar impact if I were working in private practice. But if on the government side, they might have broader implications. There might have been a particular issue that we would pursue. And I think sometimes the owner might look at the situation and sort of say, why are we fighting over this? But for us, it was something broader. There might be 20 properties that fall into that same basket, but this is the one that presented the issue that was really worth, pursuing. The facts lined up right or something like that. And I think that's true in a lot of fields that interact with government. Government may sort of pick and choose issues that it wants to focus on because they're significant in the broader scheme of things. So in that sense, I got a chance to see a whole broad range of kind of novel issues, and to really pursue them without having to think, I didn't have a client to bill, and it was with the support of the municipality to go after these things, understand them better, litigate them. And from a valuation standpoint, and I think, again, this is kind of just something that I've always enjoyed about what we do, is that I always say I'm not the appraiser. I work with appraisers all day long, but I'm really the advocate. So a lot of what I'm there to do is to look at, there may be multiple ways to value a property. There might be different opinions about how a property, like let's say something like highest and best use, or, where there can be so many different opinions about what's right, not necessarily an absolute right or wrong opinion. So to be able to kind of dig into that, really get to understand it better. So for me, that was early on really something helpful. I think the other thing that was helpful was knowing a lot about what goes into making a deal happen when you're dealing with the government. So for instance, when I don't represent governments now, but when I'm meeting with an assessor or their attorneys, I think sometimes my client may not have a really solid sense of what does it take to get the deal done. They'll see the facts and they'll say, well, it should be pretty simple, right? And I'm like, no, there's politics on the other side. There's approvals. There are sort of sometimes, I mean, I just ran into this yesterday. We're dealing with a large shopping mall, and based on the appraisals, let's say the reductions in taxes should be, say, like 80% or so. It's very significant reductions.
Yeah.
But from a negotiation standpoint, there's a question: do we go to court? Mm-hmm. Do we settle? There's an offer on the table. It's not close to that, but as a sort of general political principle, the municipality will not offer more than 50%. So what do you do with that? And sometimes it's kind of understanding that, and also understanding from a business standpoint, you might be inclined to take the 50% instead of waiting the next 2 years to see whether or not you might get more. And that's an uncertain result. And there's time involved and cost to get to that, and all the uncertainty that goes with that. So those are the kinds of things that we deal with. There's no sort of formula to it, and so that's another valuable piece of what I got out of that early experience of working for the government, is really understanding that there are some constraints. if I'm met with that, I'm not going to yell at the assessor for having that position. I get it. That's what they're constrained by.
I appreciate you highlighting that, because I recall, even as I first got exposed to this whole discipline, there are multiple interests involved. And just because from a valuation standpoint, like, hey, here's the value of the property, and then, hey, here's the assessment, you're like, okay, there's a gap. And it's very easy to come in, as you touched on, and say, well, this is the value of the property. But that doesn't mean that is going to be where the assessment lands, for a number of reasons, including, and I've dealt with this more in areas outside of large cities, that tax that comes in from, say, that shopping center is extremely important to funding of services in the local area.
Sure.
And every reduction, which may be duly appropriate for the property owner, comes at the risk of something else not getting funded or a reduction in services. It's quite fascinating how much broader the implications are.
Yeah, no, I think from a political standpoint, every time you're reducing one property's assessment, you're effectively, at least potentially, increasing the tax rate. And so if I'm the mayor, I don't like tax rates to go up. And so it may be justified to lower an assessment, but I also have to think, what is this going to do to my tax rate? Where am I going to kind of replace that value in a way that I'm not going to hurt my tax rate? So there are a lot of considerations like that. You just have to kind of be aware of that. You could say this is just a matter of valuation and law, but there's always, in what we do, there's always a political component as well.
And I appreciate you touching on the path you've taken by working in the governmental side of the industry first, and then making the transition. How much broader perspective and a sense of understanding you come in with versus just a hardline approach towards, well, I'm the advocate. I've got an expert. I've got a client. Maybe I have a couple experts, and this is the answer. It's like, yeah, that doesn't always produce the best result. Given the early work that you started with and continue to expand, how have you seen the property tax assessment field change? I mean, because you've been associated with this for a long period of time, you've been a leader in the field as well.
I think that one of the things that I've seen is there's some generally consolidation of, there are really a few components that go into the mix. There's the appraisal firms. There's greater automation, I think, in the appraisal industry. It's tough to be, I think, an appraiser in some markets. I think, and obviously depending on the types of work that you do, are you a home appraiser? Are you a big commercial type, a mall appraiser or something like that? But appraisal work is hard. I think that in terms of appraisals that are geared towards litigation, I often think that that's something that I would never want to do, because, you're kind of constantly setting yourself up to be shown to be, incompetent. Somebody's always gunning to show how you messed up, right? So, but that's there's more and more, I think, a trend in appraisal to larger companies, big data. The whole different conversation might be around AI, and I'm certainly not an expert on it, but I can see how that's beginning to develop into how appraisals get done. And then in terms of the representation of owners, there's always been, it's kind of a long history of, this is an area where there are consulting firms, non-law firms. Many of the big, so the accounting firms often have had divisions that deal with this, and then you have law firms. And I think some of that, in terms of which is more prevalent, will tend to be on the markets you're in. In a place like New York, you really can't get very far without a lawyer. And then there are other markets, if you look at a place like Texas, you can do a lot of work without a lawyer. So, so the rise of consulting firms and the growth of those consulting firms in the area, we do work with consulting firms. We're sort of, in some ways we kind of compete with them, but in a lot of ways we're also working with them too. It's not sort of an aggressive competition. We all want business, but we do actually work together.
Yes.
What I'm seeing is that some of the smaller consulting firms are sort of getting acquired by the larger firms. In terms of how things are done, I mean, And the other thing is that tax rates continue to rise. The fundamentals of what we deal with have not changed all that much. We often joke about how it's kind of hard to put us out of business given the system that we work with. There's a lot of subjectivity. There's a lot of broken parts. The intersection of politics with valuation. I mean, I'm dealing a lot now with proposed reforms to the New York City tax system. Again, another conversation, but there's a lot there that's not a clear yes or no. And so with the consolidation of a lot of these services into larger companies, one of the challenges, I think, is there's a desire to kind of automate, but then it's really hard to automate in a field in which there is so much local nuance and there is so much to be said for having local relationships. In fact, I have the National Association of Property Tax Attorneys. Wonderful group. We have lawyers in every state. And the reason for that is because exactly that, because you really, I can work with my colleague in Chicago, but I can't do what my colleague in Chicago does. He's got the relationships. He understands the system in a way that I won't ever know. I do know some folks who try to practice a lot of different jurisdictions, and I don't know how I could sleep at night. It just, there's so many rules, so many ways to trip up. I think, frankly, just easier ways to manage a portfolio through, getting the right local people, maybe having somebody that operates as kind of a quarterback. Like I'll do that for some of the portfolios where I'm their point of contact, but they also know that I'm not necessarily the person to do the work in some locations. Yes. And so it's really much better that I help them find that right person. So, and that goes for appraisals as well. I think in terms of who do you get to appraise a particular property, you really have to start with the property, the location, and different appraisers are going to be better or worse for a given property.
Yeah, that's a great point. How you talked about early on your approach for continuing to learn, and that you made the conscious effort to go back to NYU for real estate. You want to share a little bit about how your valuation knowledge has grown over time?
Sure. I have both a strong interest in appraisal. I'm fascinated by the issues. I think that there was a quote, I might butcher it a little bit. Bertram Lewis, who's one of great appraisal writers and appraiser theorists from some years ago, wrote that something along the lines of valuation is in the eyes of the beholder, and it all depends on where the beholder is standing. And yes, I think that that's something that I've always thought was true. So to me, I really learn from the appraisers I work with, and the appraisers, I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of really smart appraisers who are very thoughtful. They don't tend to just take the assignment and crank out a book report. They really give some thought. A lot of times I'll sort of hand them and I'll say, well, here's what I'm seeing. And they'll come back to me and say, well, here's how I would, especially let's say a property that may have multiple parcels and they sort of interact with each other in a certain way. And they may see a way that those parcels should be valued in a way that I'm not thinking. So I think I mostly learn just from the work that I do is every new property I deal with properties that may have intangible value, and then that becomes a kind of a real tough question. It's this, it's a hypothetical that may not even have a right answer, but you do have to get to an answer. And I think that that's always kind of an interesting challenge is, how do I arrive at a value for real property where there is no absolute bright line answer, but I do have to be persuasive about it. I do have to put together enough evidence to support the position that I'm taking. And so I'd say that's just kind of the biggest part I learned. I was involved with the Appraisal Foundation a number of years ago. Also really didn't seek that out. It just sort of came upon me. And I thought it was, it was a really interesting place to be because I ended up as the chair of the Appraisal Foundation, and I'm not an appraiser, and I was surrounded by appraisers all day, and I got to really see, what was important to appraisers, what was going on, and they're not by far, they are not in agreement about a whole lot of things. And so to kind of, manage that process and get us to a good place and manage those relationships and see what really matters. And also, I think actually one of the really interesting things that I loved about the Appraisal Foundation was it brought together people from all parts of the country, even other countries. And we had rural appraisers, farm appraisers, people really big in agriculture, people from big cities, whole range. of valuation assignments and issues and qualifications and questions like that. And, how do you ensure the public trust in what's being provided by the appraisers? So all those issues were there. And I think that kind of stuff really, really helped me to grow a lot in terms of knowing who am I working with when I'm working with an appraiser.
I completely agree with you. And that's a wonderful thing about the cross-disciplinary interaction that comes about because of the different nature of the assets. How did your work in law progress to a point that you had an opportunity to get involved in that level? Because that's not something most people even get access to.
Are you asking in the appraisal foundation itself?
Yes.
Well, I had an expert witness actually on a case I was working on. I was working on the government side, and an expert witness. He was a real estate economist who really specialized in assessment systems. So we ended up spending a lot of time together working on a case, and I got a sense of some of the work that he did outside of my case. And at the time, he was involved he was on the board of the Appraisal Foundation, and I think he just said, this is a really great group, and there may be a vacancy coming up, and I think I'd like to recommend you for that. And I said, okay, I'll take that. And I have to say, at the time, I think if you're in the appraisal field as an appraiser, you'd probably naturally have a much better sense of the Appraisal Foundation, its role, USPAP, all that stuff. But as a lawyer coming in, really my background had been as a lawyer, I didn't really even get it. I knew I got that it was an important organization, but I didn't really understand its function that well until I sort of arrived there, and I did get involved, and I was on the board, and then not too long after that, I ended up heading the organization, and so but that's how I got into it. It was a little bit of serendipity, but it was very much in line with what I was doing. It just felt like it was a good fit for the field that I was working in.
I think that's a fascinating point. And I don't know that your perspective is too unfamiliar for a lot of professionals in the industry who are like, it kind of exists, but I don't really know much about it.
Right.
Definitely understand. And then along the way, you mentioned how you started an organization for the benefit of connecting peers across the country. Can you share a little bit about that experience? Because I think that's something that a lot of appraisal peers also don't have that experience of, like, that global, or in this case, at least national connectivity.
Yeah. At the time, I was the chairman of the American Bar Associations. They have a property tax committee, and I was the chair. Well, and I would just say I was probably the chair because nobody else wanted to be the chair.
Kind of like commercial litigation back when you took the tax lien.
Right. So it was the kind of thing where, the American Bar Association does a lot of great things. I think that in a lot of ways, though, what it does best is serve the needs of lawyers who have practices that tend to lend themselves to more national in scope, like income tax,
yes,
or securities litigation, or you name the bankruptcy. Let's say these are all fields where I could bring together a bankruptcy lawyer from New York and a bankruptcy lawyer from California. They're going to have a lot to talk about, very similar. They're dealing with the same basic code and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Property tax, not so much. And so I remember finding myself at an ABA conference. I was putting together programming for our group. And the problem I faced was that I could bring in a property tax lawyer from Chicago and a property tax lawyer from Texas and a property tax lawyer from New York. And they might all have something interesting to say, but none of them are particularly that interested in what the other one has to say.
Yes.
Because it doesn't really apply. And so I remember mentioning this to somebody else there, and that person said, you should talk to my partner. And her partner is John Brusniak. He's in Texas, a fine lawyer in Texas, who was in the process of doing exactly this, is kind of building a network of attorneys who could share, but in a way that really made better sense for people in property tax. And so I worked with him and several other people who helped found. It certainly wasn't all me. We co-founded the organization. I think it was around 2005-ish or so. And we built from there, adding in, and it's a continuing process. Now and then we may have an attorney retire. We go look for somebody, but it's an invitation-based organization. It's not just sort of an open membership. We really try to make sure we're getting the best in the field for each location. Some states may have multiple attorneys because, for example, if I were in Pennsylvania, the person who knows Philadelphia may be a different kind of person in terms of relationships and knowledge in the system and all that from the person handling Pittsburgh. So, you have to be kind of aware of those nuances, but that's kind of how we put it together.
That's fascinating. And I can appreciate the benefit of having the perspectives of peers across the country. As you mentioned, an invite-only community. So there's a high level of professional accomplishment and the privileged ability to share that's not out in the open market. It's not like it's one of those like Twitter feeds or something. It's like it's the members connecting with each other. Given that you've had so much involvement in valuation throughout your career, and it's obviously a vital part of the advocacy that you do, what have you gleaned through a number of the matters that you've worked on that might be helpful for valuation professionals listening to be informed of? Like, hey, here's some things you might want to think about if you want to get into this space, or if you're in it, here's how to do it better. And maybe here's some things don't do.
Yeah. I guess I would start with, what do I think about when I'm making a recommendation to a client about why we should hire a particular appraiser? There are a number of considerations. One is experience with the particular asset type.
Yes.
And especially as you get outside of something like a plain vanilla office building, if you're dealing with a shopping mall or a hotel or a resort property, let's say, those are going to have some unique characteristics in terms of what's really relevant from understanding the market, understanding supply and demand for those types of assets that you probably only get from having some real experience doing them. It's really difficult to take on an assignment like that just out of the blue. And so one thing that's important is it can be really helpful to kind of get some specialization in a particular asset class that you like to work with. Hotels, just understanding the market for hotels, understanding the dynamics of how a hotel really operates, the role of franchising, the role of the hotel operator and all the other components, food and beverage services and all that stuff, the different theories that go into how do we separate out real estate value from tangible or intangible property and, the other assets that go into the mix. So I think a big part of it is being able to show that you've got that experience in that asset type. Pricing is always a difficult. You'll always say to the client, I have no idea how an appraiser prices their work, but it's going to be significant. And I'll see vast differences. I may get multiple appraisal quotes from qualified appraisers, and they can be tens of thousands of dollars different for a large assignment.
Mm-hmm.
And if the client is asking why, I sometimes have a hard time explaining why. But I think it's important to be aware of what the market is for those services. So that's a big one. Maybe more than anything is kind of personality driven, and I'll say that in terms of both. You want to be able to be authoritative, but not ego driven. Sometimes I find that it's a real turnoff, and I'm talking about you get into court. And the judge, or maybe a jury, if you're in front of a jury, can be turned off by, somebody who seems to kind of know everything. But at the same time, you do want to be authoritative. You do want to be confident. If you're sort of wishy-washy and you're all over the place, well, that could be true. That could be true. That probably doesn't help the case. So those are some of the things that I think in terms of professional development, know the field, know the latest developments. Also getting that They're the jurisdictional exceptions. So if you're working with a lawyer, you're not, I shouldn't say just, but you're not cranking out a cookie cutter appraisal. You're going to have to work within some. So for example, in New York, for the most part, we ignore highest and best use. Mm-hmm. It's like the appraiser is looking and saying, but I need to deal with highest and best use. But within New York, you kind of need to deal with it the way that New York deals with it in property tax. And then you may be dealing with just the format. For example, it might be really bad. It might be much better in a given case, for example, to do a discounted cash flow. I mean, in terms of really knowing why you think a property is worth what it's worth, and especially, let's say, a property that is on the cusp of a repositioning or something like that. So why is an investor thinking what they're thinking? Discounted cash flow could be very helpful. And yet, for a particular court need, the court will roll its eyes or just not even look. The court may just say, we just don't do that. They want a direct cap. So understanding those things is really important. So I think that a lot of this is, if you're not already, we have some relationships with appraisers where they know what we need. They know the rules of the game and all that stuff. But really, I think it's helpful to really have those conversations. Maybe just, have lunch with the lawyer that you might be working with and try to nail down some of the basic principles of what's important to them. What is the client expecting? Turnaround time is communication, all those things go into the mix as well. It's just so everybody kind of knows what to expect. And also deadlines, deadlines are always a real bear to deal with. And sometimes you have a court setting a deadline for an exchange and then it changes. And so making sure that everybody knows, nobody wants surprises or any of that stuff. So
very much so. I thank you for sharing that. I think that's quite insightful, especially for people that, as you touch on, we'll call it cookie cutter nature of certain types of assignments, certain types of properties for a certain user, very different, as you have highlighted, when you move over to ad valorem work. And now it's in a court of law and there's multiple professionals involved. And it doesn't matter how right you think your opinion is. And of course, as appraisers, we can only advocate for our opinions. And David, you get to advocate for the client. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that everyone else sees it the same way.
Right, exactly.
You've also been involved. I appreciate an article that you had contributed to or you authored around the excess proceeds.
Oh, yeah. I think what you're talking about is the retention,
yes.
Surplus retention statutes, right? So that was a big issue this year, really. It came to a head in a U.S. Supreme Court case. I was actually the counsel on one of the amicus briefs for New York on this issue. And the case originated in Minnesota, and it's called Tyler v. Hennepin. Mm-hmm. And in that case, and this is a fairly common scenario, is you had an elderly woman who owned a condo. It was taken for back taxes. She owed, I may be fudging the numbers here a little bit, but whatever it was, there was a delta between what she owed and what the municipality sold of about, I think, $40,000. That was the home equity she had built up in the property. It was sold, and the rule in Minnesota was that the government gets to keep that surplus. And that same type of scenario would apply in 12 states in the United States. The other states don't have that, but New York is one of them. And I know that from a long time ago when I handled these types of tax foreclosure processes for the government, one of the issues that would come up is exactly this, is that we would be foreclosing on property for unpaid taxes. Mm-hmm. And in that process, even some banks would send me a notice that says, just assuming that this works like a mortgage foreclosure, they would say, well, you go ahead with your process, but we're just letting you know that we're here as a lien holder because we have our mortgage. And when it's all said and done, we're just claiming, our portion out of the surplus. And I would say, you're not getting it. This is not a mortgage foreclosure. And in a tax lien foreclosure in a state like New York, yes, we keep all the surplus. So you're either going to step in and pay the taxes to preserve your lien, or you're going to be completely out of luck. So that was always the case. It was the way the law worked, and it always seemed like not much, fair or not, that's just what the law says. So this case, the Tyler v. Hennepin case, really challenged that, and I think very wisely so. I sort of wish that if I could go back in time, I think I really applaud the lawyers who took this up in the first place, because it was the right thing to do, really saying that by keeping this excess, which is the homeowner's equity, and it's kind of this ephemeral thing. It's not the real estate, it's not cash sitting in an account, but it is the value, this added value that is yours as the homeowner. And the claim is that it's an unconstitutional taking of property without compensation. And that claim was successful in the U.S. Supreme Court. That's something that I've been speaking about lately, because it's been kind of a hot issue. But I think at long last, justice has been done on that issue.
I think that's such an important thing. My experience with it is, having been an owner of a lot of properties and bought many, gained access to ownership through many different pathways, several of them through tax lien purchases, or actually buying position from someone who had bought it, and personally dealt with one of those situations where a woman and her husband, this couple owned an apartment building. They lived in one unit. He passed away. And my take on things was that she just kind of didn't want to deal with anything and literally didn't answer doors. And years go by, taxes get sold, and the taxes were sold. They were redeemed by a tax buyer, and it was for about a sixth of the value of the building.
Right.
And now she's out of her home. And we ultimately worked with her and kept her there, and then got her, relocated her, really helped her out. But the system, as you talk about it, the system, it did no favors for her. And as a matter of fact, stripped away what she was rightfully owed. I mean, as an opinion, not as a course of law. So I definitely appreciate the work that you've been involved in that Tyler versus Hennepin case.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. So as we start to move to wrap up, we always like to ask the question. So given everything you've experienced and what you've contributed to, what you've learned, and as you look ahead over the next 3 to 5 years, what are you optimistic about?
Well, I guess I would start by saying I think I'm optimistic that I'm going to remain in practice for a while, because a lot of what we deal with, there's sort of always new issues. There's always new valuation challenges. Just when you think one problem gets solved, 3 others crop up. And so my job is kind of as a problem solver. And so I think that the real estate markets provide an endless source of interesting issues to deal with. Even now, I think maybe more than ever, a lot of people look at what's happening, let's say, in the office sector, which is probably top of the heap right now in terms of interesting places to look at big changes going on, and how people use office space. Well, on the one hand, you might say that office and as a general class is suffering right now. That opens up the door to so many, something's going to happen. Is the office sector going to turn into a lot of residential? Is it going to be redeveloped in some way that we don't see? What about, a lot of land use patterns, especially when you look at cities, are what's developed over the last 100 years or so, with very segmented sectors of a city, where you've got residential areas, you've got business, and then you've got manufacturing, and they're all kind of in. And now what we're starting to see is a rethinking of the city with a lot more multi-use development projects. You see a kind of a different, like if I look at New York City, some locations are particularly created around a functional reason for being there, maybe certain natural resources, something like that.
Yes.
A place like New York City, which is largely built around the financial services industry, could theoretically be anywhere. So now, you say to yourself, so if the need for office is not what it once was, what's going to keep the city interesting and vibrant? Why is anybody going to stay in the city? So the city has to become like a fun place to be. It has to be a place that could be affordable, better than what it is now, because it's very unaffordable, like a lot of big cities. So there's a lot of changes going on. And at the end of the day, property tax is always sort of low on the list of things that people tend to think about. And yet it's such a driver of how people use. For example, right now, there are a lot of talk about re-engineering New York City's property tax system. Some of the unintended consequences could be that if it's not done right, there could be a lot of people that are driven out of the city into the suburbs. That's going to change a lot of the dynamics of the city, a lot of the ancillary businesses that serve those people. So it's not just office, it's retail, it's restaurants, it's all that stuff. So there's a lot going on. It all affects value.
Yes.
It implies a lot of valuation work. The investors in real estate, those profiles are changing as well. We have a lot of different types of investment going on. There's a lot of opportunistic investment, and they all need to know what it's worth. So I think I'm very optimistic that there's just a lot of interesting questions that still have to be answered, and questions we don't even know, haven't even been asked. So there's probably a lot of interesting work for appraisers and lawyers for a long time to come.
Yes, and yes. That is definitely the case. And, maybe we all be fortunate enough to live into this future.
Yeah.
That soon one day will also be history. So that'll be fantastic.
Yes, absolutely.
David, I really appreciate the time today. Thank you for sharing the perspective. It's one that many don't get to hear or don't get exposed to. And you've had a significant career and had a lot of contributions, not only in the property taxation space, but also in the intersection of valuation. And just want to say, thank you for all that you have done and are doing.
Well, thank you, Michael. Pleasure talking with you. It's been a lot of fun. So thanks again.
Oh, very much so. And again, just as a reminder, make sure, especially for maybe some of your peers, maybe not you necessarily, but this conversation may have been completely new to you. Feel free and be generous in your sharing so that we continue to expand the learning and understanding, as well as the insights of a professional who does a lot of property tax representation for clients locally and great impact across the market area. So with that, we're going to bring this podcast episode to a close. And until the next one, keep on keeping up the value. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Zing's Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing life paths and achievements of our guests. Don't forget to like us on LinkedIn and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Zing's Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.